there's a very fine line between influence and intimidation and infiltration, which China consistently goes over.
Mm.
And I think that in the enthusiasm to cultivate business links with China, this organizations, others which are linked very closely to the Chinese Communist Party, have been allowed in, invited in, with almost no questions asked, to some of the most sensitive parts of the British economy.
The Sunday Times has photographs of an alleged Chinese spy who became a close confidant of Prince Andrew, meeting two former Prime Ministers, David Cameron and Theresa May. We're not sure when the meetings took place and whether they were in office at the time. The suspected agent, known only at this point as H6, has now been banned from the UK. MPs are threatening to name him under parliamentary privilege as this row grows over how the Duke of York came to be compromised. Ian Williams is the author of Vampire State, The Rise and Fall of the Chinese Economy. Morning, Ian.
Good morning, Callum.
So shall we start with the level of access this suspected Chinese agent has had? So we've been talking all weekend about Prince Andrew, and now we can add David Cameron and Theresa May into the mix as well. What is your level of concern, Ian?
I think it's remarkable and quite shocking the extent to which he has been able to get this access to the British political, and not just the political elite, but academic and other business circles. These photographs, which were carried by overseas media who have named this individual, which suggests to me that his name will come out in the next few days, because it's all getting a little bit absurd. Now, the photographs were actually on the desk of this person's office in London. They were carried in a documentary on Chinese Central Television about him. So he wasn't shy about some of the links he had among the British elite. And I know that over the coming days, there will be far more coming out, because he was also a member of other top-level British business associations, one in particular which is dedicated to strengthening the links between China and the UK, and whose fellows include Tony Blair, Lord Mendelssohn, and Jonathan Powell, who was last month appointed as the UK National Security Advisor. Now, nobody's suggesting they did anything inappropriate, but it is remarkable that this individual was moving in that sort of circles, and that he was able to get access to people at that sort of level.
In terms, Ian, of what you're talking about there, you mentioned the associations that are designed to promote business links between the UK and China, and I can't guess away from the thought that governments have been encouraging engagement with China, looking for business ties, looking for investment, looking for trade deals for years. David Cameron's the shining example of that, isn't he? In terms of how he tried to promote UK-China relations. To what extent are political leaders in this country asking for trouble by doing that?
They are asking for trouble, but I think it's also the nature of the organization they're dealing with. The United Front Works Department conjures up these images of, municipal workers in high-vis jackets or hard hats, but it's actually a very sinister organization, secretive organization, which has very close links to the Chinese Ministry of State Security, which is its main espionage agency. I think that gaining influence is the stuff of diplomacy. That's what diplomats do. But where this organization differs is that it's a clandestine organization. It's a covert organization. There's a very fine line between influence and intimidation and infiltration, which China consistently goes over. And I think that in the enthusiasm to cultivate business links with China, organizations, others which are linked very closely to the Chinese Communist Party, have been allowed in, invited in, with almost no questions asked, to some of the most sensitive parts of the British economy. And I think that this attitude, which very much arose from the David Cameron, George Osborne era, the golden era of cultivating relations with China, where the due diligence often boiled down to the number of zeros on the cheque, meant that the necessary diligence was not done. and people who were acting on behalf of the Chinese Communist Party, whose intentions were far more sinister, who were there to gather intelligence, to cultivate links with what can best be described as useful idiots, that's a term that came out of Soviet times, has been allowed to proceed in a quite shocking manner.
Yeah. One of the other considerations that's been rumbling as we've discussed this weekend, Ian, is about accountability and within that transparency. And the royal family is next level when it comes to actually how difficult it is to understand what their arrangements are, whether that's financially or diplomatically in these sorts of circumstances. But then also we have questions, don't we, about how transparent politicians are. I know that you've written previously about David Cameron and the Foreign Office links, even this year, and the Foreign Office and the disclosure by the Times that the department and the Foreign Office had refused to say whether Cameron had recused himself from parts of his role as Foreign Secretary due to previous financial interests. And so all of this is a whole feast of a lack of accountability. We don't know exactly what's going on here.
We don't, and arguably the royal family is perhaps on the transparency level roughly on par with the Chinese Communist Party. But yes, I mean, when David Cameron left office, he was engaged in numerous business endeavors which were linked to China. And which he was very reluctant to disclose in full. Now, under the last government, a new national security law was implemented. And one of the key provisions of that law was a foreign influence registration scheme, which was aimed at stopping precisely what we're seeing at the moment. It would require anybody lobbying or working on behalf of a foreign government to declare that interest and face penalties if they didn't. But the current government, in its desperation to cozy up to China, has parked this provision. And the reason they've done that, they say that they're too busy, the schedule at the moment, legislative, and they'll to tackle it right now. But part of the reason why this has been parked is because of arguments over where China should be, because it's a tiered system with the countries regarded as the biggest risk, the hostile countries in the top tier. And business has been lobbying furiously to prevent China being put in that tier. HSBC, for instance, has been at the forefront of this. And the reason for that is because they don't want their dealings with China closely examined. They don't want that transparency. And I think it is quite shocking that we have a situation where this comes as a surprise, where almost on a daily basis we're seeing the degree of access, the degree of infiltration by groups associated with Chinese espionage. And I think it does come down to this shocking lack of transparency and which continues with this current government in its reluctance to implement in full this registration scheme.
What then of where things go from here? So we've got MPs circling now, including Nigel Farage, who would say it smacks of an establishment cover-up, basically. The fact we don't know it's not been made public what this person's name actually is. We've got Sir Ian Duncan-Smith suggesting that he's going to push for an urgent question and therefore debate in the Commons tomorrow, saying that Prince Andrew needs to be transparent and the security services should be investigating exactly what is going on here. I think one of my considerations, Ian, the quote that stuck with me through the weekend around Prince Andrew was that judges described an unusual degree of trust from a senior member of the royal family who was prepared to enter into business activities with this alleged spy. Would his connection, in your view, to the two former prime ministers in question here, Lord Cameron and Baroness May, would his connection to these two be described in those same terms, an unusual degree of trust, without knowing, of course, the exact details of the events at which this person attended? And if so, what do we do here? How can we have the best of both worlds? Perhaps that's impossible. We can't trade with China in this way and then be alarmed when Chinese spies infiltrate the British establishment.
It is. I mean, I think that goes to the crux of the dilemma that's faced consecutive governments in the UK. You know, how do you reap the supposed economic benefits of the relationship with China while at the same time being aware and of your security needs, the concerns over human rights. And arguably, China policy is a mess.
Mm.
And I think that what differentiates, I suppose, Cameron and May from the Prince is the Duke of York was desperate and not terribly bright, shall we say, in his business dealings. Whereas I suppose Cameron and May could argue that they come across numerous people, that
Yes.
they shake many, many hands every day, or did as when they were in office, and that perhaps the onus should be more on those who scrutinise those with access. But I would just say that there's other quite chilling elements of this with the Prince's scheme, Pitchat Palace, which was aimed to put budding entrepreneurs and those with bright ideas in Britain in touch with cash, in touch with people that would back them. Now, this was extended to China, and in fact, this individual ran the Chinese end of that operation. And it's quite chilling to me that here we are, some of the top British ideas that the palace was, quite thankfully promoting, but the people it was promoting it to were in China, and the
Yeah.
degree of access of Chinese money and Chinese organizations to British startup ideas and IP facilitated by the palace is itself truly shocking.
Ian, we always appreciate speaking to you. Thank you for your time this morning. That's Ian Williams, the author of Vampire State, The Rise and Fall of the Chinese Economy. Don't let it go unnoticed that Ian has just said on this programme that the royal family is on a par with the Chinese Communist Party when it comes to transparency. Is that cause for alarm for you when you hear that? Does that sort of, it's made me sort of consider exactly what that means and whether we should be content with that, particularly in light of what we're learning this weekend.